The son who returned from military service looking for his mother and discovered a truth that shattered him. David was walking down the dirt road with a smile on his face, his uniform spotless, shoulders squared, and a bouquet of white daisies in his hands. The sun warmed his face gently. After 2 years away in service, all he wanted was to smell his mother's coffee, to hear her soft voice say, "My boy's back." The village appeared on the horizon like a hazy memory. But as he drew closer, what had once felt like home looked deserted. There were no voices, no aroma of cooking, no children running through the square, just the sound of the wind sweeping dry leaves and doors creaking in the distance. He paused for a moment. The same street he'd grown up on now seemed smaller, grayer, empty, a place that had aged without him. When he reached the house, his chest swelled with hope. But one look was enough to fill him with unease. The wooden gate had been replaced by iron. The walls, once beige, were painted an unfeeling grey. The windows, always open, were now locked, curtains drawn. David hesitated before knocking. The door groaned open. But it wasn't his mother who stood there. It was Muriel. His brother stared at him like he was a stranger, no reaction on his face, no spark in his eyes. The silence stretched on, too long. "Where is she?" David asked, holding up the flowers. Muriel looked away, took a deep breath. His voice was low, flat. She's gone." David frowned, confused. "What do you mean, gone?" "Months ago. She said she didn't want to be a burden anymore. Packed a few things and left, that's it." The words hung in the air. David glanced around, expecting to see a suitcase, a note, anything. But there was nothing, just emptiness. He stepped inside without asking. The house was unrecognizable. His mother's crochet doilies, the picture frames, the rocking chair. Everything was gone. Even the scent he remembered, the smell of soap and cornmeal cake had vanished. Ivana appeared in the hallway, Muriel's wife. Tense, she forced a smile that didn't reach her eyes. She seemed tired, David. She wanted peace. Tired. His mother, who looked after everyone, who laughed loudly, who saved his letters tied with red ribbon. David walked through the living room in silence, as if visiting a grave. Every absence felt like a slap. Every change, a betrayal. Not a single thing remained to show she'd ever lived there. "You threw everything away?" he asked without looking at anyone. "That was her decision," Muriel replied too quickly. David said nothing. He went out to the porch and stared down the street. The daisies were still in his hand, but now they were wilted, crushed between his fingers. The pain wasn't just from his mother's absence. It was the indifference, the silence that screamed, the sense that they were lying and didn't even bother to hide it. Without another word, he walked away, and with each step down the road, his pace felt heavier. The wind struck his face like a warning. Something inside him churned, as if a buried truth was clawing its way out. She wouldn't have left like that, not without telling him, not that way. There, with the broken flowers in his hand, David made a silent promise. He would find her and uncover the truth. David walked through the village streets, still holding the daisies, now broken and drooping like his hope. With every step, his chest tightened. The place that had once been home now felt complicit in a dark secret. He knocked on Mrs. Clara's door, the one who always offered rain donuts on Sunday afternoons. She opened with a strained smile. When he asked about his mother, the smile wilted. "I haven't seen her in ages," she said, glancing behind her as if she wanted to escape the conversation. On the next street, old Mr. Samuel, his mother's pen pal, pretended not to hear when David called out. He waved, muttered something about running late, and hurried off. It was like everyone knew, but no one would speak. The feeling was suffocating, as if his mother's disappearance had been neatly buried under the town's routine, and David was walking among people who chose to forget. In the market, amid sacks of flour and the smell of onions, a woman with a purple headscarf approached. She looked at him, not just at his face, but at his pain. "You're Mrs. Isadora's son, aren't you?" David nodded, hopeful. "I saw someone like her a few weeks ago, sleeping by the old road bridge. I thought she was just another lost soul. But now, I'm almost sure it was her." The ground seemed to shift beneath David's feet. He thanked her, then hurried off, his heart pounding. He wove through the alleys lining the outskirts of town, each turn a possible reunion or a new disappointment. The sky was darkening, and the scent of rain made his heart pound even faster. Then there, among cardboard boxes and overturned trash bags, he stopped. A figure knelt, rummaging through scraps, as if searching for something that wasn't lost, only hidden. Her hair was grey and tangled, her clothes torn and stained. The silhouette, once so familiar, now appeared someone else entirely. But David knew. He knew the moment the wind lifted a stray lock of hair, like the universe wanted him to see. "Mom?" The woman turned slowly, her eyes hollow and terrified. For a moment she stared at him, then offered a fragile, confused smile. "Caesar," she whispered in a barely audible voice. Caesar, his father's name, long dead. David's heart shattered into 1,000 pieces. He dropped to his knees, arms outstretched. She recoiled, startled. "It's me, David, your son." She looked again, more closely this time. That face, that voice. And then, in a sudden gesture, she wept. She cried like a lost child, like someone who'd carried too much silence for far too long. She flung herself into his arms, trembling, murmuring, I knew you'd come back." David held her tight, breathing in the smell of dirt, sweat, and neglect, but also feeling her warmth. His mother was still alive, but what had they done to her? The walk to the inn was slow. David carried his mother in his arms as if she were made of glass, too light, too fragile. Every step echoed a question. How did they let this happen? How did no one do anything? She didn't say much. She murmured disconnected names and broken phrases, and every now and then called out for César. She was so detached from reality, she barely recognized the streets she'd lived on her whole life. When they reached the little room, David gently laid her on the bed. She looked around like a frightened child and asked if she could take off her shoes. "Of course, Mom, of course." Silence settled for a moment. He wanted to say so much, but didn't know where to start. Then she whispered, "Is there any bread?" The question took him by surprise. "Bread?" She nodded, eyes wide and hungry. "And bananas, if there are bananas." He swallowed hard, trying to smile. He grabbed his wallet and ran out. Minutes later, he returned with a bag, 2 loaves of bread, 4 bananas, and a small water bottle. She took it like it was a feast. She ate with trembling hands, eyes closed, chewing slowly, as if tasting life coming back bit by bit. David couldn't hold back the tears. The scene was simple, but cruel. The woman who'd raised him with so much love was now there, eating like someone saved from starvation by a miracle. When she finished, she wiped her mouth on her sleeve, looked at him, and this time really saw him. "David, it really is you." He nodded, crying. She touched his face, just like she used to when he got hurt as a child. "I dreamed about this so much, so many days, alone." "Mom," he said, voice choking, "tell me, what happened to you?" She sighed, trembling, but now her eyes were clear, sad, but present. Then she began to speak. She drew in a steady breath, as if diving into memories she'd rather leave behind. "It started after you left. things began to change. She spoke softly, pausing as if each word had to push through a wall of pain. At first, it was just complaints, that I let the faucet drip, that my radio was too loud, that I took up too much space in the living room. Ivana didn't say anything, but she'd look at me, like I was a nuisance, like I didn't belong anymore. David clenched his fists. The room seemed to shrink around him. One day, Murillo pulled me aside. He said I should think about living with a relative, that the house was too small for all of us. He said that I was getting forgetful, asking too many questions. She stared at the empty wall, her voice breaking. I didn't want to make things worse, so I shut up. I started going out more, staying away longer, but that only made things worse. David interrupted, voice tight. And when did you leave? She lowered her eyes. I didn't leave, I was put out. The words hit him like a bomb. He gave me a bag with 2 changes of clothes and said that if I wanted to live on my own terms, I could. Said you wouldn't be back for a long time, that I should accept my place. David sprang to his feet. He paced the room like a caged animal, fury burning in his gut. And your things, your chair, your photos, your clothes? They went with the house's new look. They said they were remodeling. My rocking chair. Murillo sold it for 20 reais to a neighbor, your father's Bible. They threw it out with the old books. She spoke with the calm of someone who'd cried all she had left to cry. But David hadn't. He felt like each revelation was another nail driven into his heart. The brother he respected, the home he loved. Everything turned against the woman who deserved care most. He moved toward the door. I'm going to talk to him now. No, David. She tried to sit up, but her body wouldn't cooperate. He had his hand on the doorknob. He needs to hear this. He needs to know what he did to you. David, don't. Her voice was weak but firm. He stopped. If you go in there with that kind of anger, it'll hurt more than help. She reached for him. He turned slowly and sat beside her. I just don't want to see you two destroy each other. That would hurt me worse than anything I've been through. She pulled him close, as if trying to keep the past from swallowing the present. David closed his eyes, and he cried. David stayed awake all night. Sitting on the floor of the boarding house room, head resting on his knees, he listened to his mother's soft breathing as she slept. He replayed every word she'd said, every image flashing through his mind. Murillo selling her chair, Ivana erasing her from the house, the coldness, the cruelty. His blood boiled. He wanted to scream, to pound on that house door and shove the whole truth in his brother's face, to make the world see what they'd done to the woman who loved him more than anything. But at dawn, as the shy sunlight crept into the room, his mother woke. She looked at him with tired but still gentle eyes, reached out and motioned for him to come closer. In the small bag she held was an old notebook, its cover torn. This was your father's, she said, opening it carefully. He wrote down verses. Used to say that when the pain is too strong, it's the word that keeps you standing. She ran her finger over the pages until she stopped at one shaky entry. Do not be overcome by evil, but overcome evil with good. Romans 12:21. David read it quietly, feeling a lump form in his throat. I know what they did to me, she said softly. And I know the anger you feel is justified, but if you carry that hatred in your heart, it will eat away all the good in you. She squeezed his hand. Your father used to say that forgiving isn't forgetting. It's deciding that the pain no longer rules you. David said nothing. His eyes brimmed with tears, but inside something began to loosen. The knot of revolt, the anchor of hurt, the idea that justice can only come through confrontation. That morning, he made a different choice. He returned to the village, not to face Murillo, but to start over. He found simple work at the market, hauling sacks, stacking crates. He earned little, but enough to pay for the boarding house and to feed his mother with dignity. Day by day, she came back to herself. She began to smile again, to tell stories, to remember the neighbors' names and the flowers in the yard. And David, in silence, rebuilt what had been broken, not with anger, but with presence. Sometimes Murillo would walk by on the street. He'd glance from afar, the same cold look as before, only now with something new underneath, discomfort, or maybe guilt. David never greeted him, but he didn't look away either. His war was now different. He knew that winning this time meant refusing to let hatred win. When he got his first paycheck, David didn't think twice. He didn't buy new clothes or treat himself to anything. He went straight to the junk pile in the neighbor's yard, where he'd heard his mother's old rocking chair had ended up. There it was, filthy, its seat broken, forgotten among cans of dry paint and broken window panes. But it was her chair, the one she rocked him in as a child, the one she mended while listening to the radio, the one she sat in waiting for him to come home from school with a smile. He bought it for almost nothing. Over the next few days, he sanded, painted, and repaired it with his own hands. Every hammered nail was a wound being sewn shut. Every restored detail was a memory rescued from the depths. The following week, he rented a small backyard cottage and brought his mother there. On the bare dirt patch, he planted daisies, a little white garden in honor of that afternoon where everything began. When she saw the restored chair on the porch of their new home, she said nothing. She just brought a hand to her mouth and wept, like someone realizing that even after everything, there can still be beauty in the world. In that humble, modest space, life began again. David cared for her with the same devotion she'd shown him. He made coffee just the way she liked it. He sat by her side, listening to her stories, the old ones, the painful ones, even the ones she made up just to laugh. The days passed simple but full. Until one late afternoon, under an orange sky, Murillo appeared. He stood at the gate, hands in his pockets, his expression unreadable. His mother saw him first. She didn't hesitate. With effort, she rose and opened her arms. Murillo walked forward slowly, as if carrying an invisible weight. When he reached them, he didn't say a word. He didn't have to. His look said it all. David watched from a few steps back, his heart in his throat. For a moment he thought about turning away, but the memory of his mother reading from the Bible, saying that resentment makes the bearer sick too, kept him rooted. He took a step, then another. He stopped in front of his brother. The two men stood facing each other. Two histories, two silences that had hurt too much. Murillo dropped his gaze. Have no excuse. David simply nodded. I know. There was no embrace, no declaration of forgiveness. But there was a moment, a new space between them, a silent truce, the start of something that might one day grow into reconciliation. His mother sat back down in the rocking chair, watching them like she was witnessing a small but real miracle. And the daisies in the garden swayed in the breeze as living witnesses that, even after pain, injustice, and loss, love can still bloom. Because forgiveness doesn't erase the past, but it's the only way to make the future worth having.